Historical Society Monday, so that's my announcement.
So let's welcome Dr. Pamela Newkirk.
Thank you. It's an honor to be here today, and I'm really inspired by everything I've heard thus far, and it's probably no accident that each speaker has referenced the whole issue of the criminal justice system, right? You know, when I was young, and some of you are old enough to remember names like Arthur Miller and Eleanor Bumpers and Michael Stewart, and we were in the streets, right, with Reverend Daughtry, you know, protesting, you know, these atrocities against unarmed blacks. And here we are again, it's like deja vu, you know, talking about people like, you know, Michael Brown and Trayvon Martin. So it's been an endless cycle, but I'm encouraged and inspired by the activism of all of you, and, you know, Black Lives Matter. I've been talking to a lot of the youth activists involved in that movement. So I'm going to talk a little bit about my book, Spectacle, The Astonishing Life of Ota Benga, which I could not have known when I started researching this 5 years ago that it would tap into this whole idea of Black Lives Matter, because Ota Benga is probably a metaphor for Black lives not mattering at all, and no one even pretending that Black lives matter. So in 1906, Ota Benga, a boyish young man from the Congo, was exhibited in the Bronx Zoo Monkey House, at times with an orangutan. And the exhibit drew tens of thousands of New Yorkers to the Bronx Zoo to behold this spectacle. The exhibit was written about by newspapers across the country and in Europe. It was heralded as like the greatest thing. This young man, a teenager, caught in the crosshairs of colonialism and the degradation and utter disregard for Black life, was held against his wishes in this cage. And for 1 month, 250,000 people went to the zoo to see Ota Benga. When Black ministers protested the exhibit, the mayor refused to intervene or meet with them. The New York Times said, "Why would you protest? According to our information, he's kind of, you know, he's like an animal. He's lower than, you know, he's not, he's subhuman." And so this was the prevailing ideology of the time. This exhibit was not only sanctioned by all of the eminent men of New York City, but by leading scientists of that time, including the zoo director, William Hornaday, who at the time was the nation's leading zoologist, also the founding director of the National Zoo in Washington, D.C., close friend of Teddy Roosevelt. So these are not marginalized figures in New York City. These were the leading men of the city who sanctioned this exhibit. And so the book kind of chronicles what was going on in New York City at this time that would enable something like this to be seen at the turn of the 20th century as somehow progressive, or as science, or as something that educated people would get behind. So, like I said, I could not know when I began this book that some would see Ota Benga as a metaphor for Black males today. Ota Benga was hunted in the Congo. The man who brought him here wrote an article published in the St. Louis Post-Dispatch, "How I Hunted Pygmies in Africa." He went there heavily armed with the approval of New York, U.S. government officials and King Leopold II to bring back so-called pygmies to exhibit first at the St. Louis World's Fair. And I mean, these people were treated in the worst possible way. I mean, imagine if you think they can be exhibited, what you're willing to do to them. So another part of the book that I wanted to address is that for 100 years, the people who most exploited Ota Benga also had the final say on what happened. So the Bronx Zoo and its retelling of of the narrative says that it's unlikely he had ever been exhibited, even though it was chronicled in their own bulletin. The New York Times, which in 1906 had written dozens of articles on the exhibit. It was, the first headline was "Bushman shares a cage with Bronx Park apes." 10 years later, when Oda Banga died, said that it never happened, that it was urban legend. 10 years later, 1916, the New York Times in an article said that while that was said it happened, he actually was employed by the zoo and somehow. And so this narrative has been so sanitized and recycled that in 1992, the grandson of the man who went to the Congo hunting so-called pygmies and so horribly degraded Oda Banga, he wrote a book about the friendship between his grandfather and Oda Banga.
Oh my God.
I mean, and that book became a New York Times notable book. Oda Banga, the Pygmy in the Zoo. So
Oh my God.
that story has been recycled all over the world about Samuel Werner and Oda Banga being friends. As implausible as that may sound to you, it was accepted as fact and inscribed in that story. That story's been inscribed into the hard drive of history. I found it in a encyclopedia in Virginia. I mean, it's, if you check Wikipedia, like no matter where you go, that had been the definitive story on what happened to Oda Banga. So what I had to do to uncover what really happened is I went into the archives where there were voluminous documents that allowed me to retrace Oda Banga's footsteps from the Congo across the United States, and almost daily I could see what was happening to Oda Banga at the Bronx Zoo, what he was doing and what the men who caged him were doing and saying about him as they tried to then clean up the story. So all of it is documented, and the book is based on all primary documents, census data, letters, anthropological field notes, ship passenger records. So there were a number of documents that allow us to retrace his steps and find out what really happened. So that's it for me. Any questions?
Yeah, we'll take questions.
I just want to thank you, Doc, being an African myself, and I know there are quite a few of us at this table who helped shape some of these contradictions in our part of the world. I just want to make two parallel observations. Number one, as we speak today, and I'm sure my colleagues will, those of you who look at the world, there are very similar Oda Banga stories taking place in Africa right now. Mm-hmm. What you have done is remarkable. Leaders on the continent of Africa, many of them have, I don't know if I'm going to go to Africa after I say this, they have literally giving our continent to other people with other sensitivities.
That's right.
And that is a fact. Second, I want to go directly to what this process is about, and I've been dreaming and thinking that perhaps I need to say this also. This opportunity that is presented at this table, people come, they share very, very important information. This is really remarkable. But at the end of the day, let me go back to my mentor. He says, Sadiq, where do we go from here? We get all of this important information, even if we could take two of those critical issues and let every person or leader on this table focus on one or two things, that we can make a difference together. No one organization or individual today could fight this battle.
That's right.
We must engage frontline people on both sides of the Atlantic, Caribbean, Latin America. Believe me, it is not pretty. And I want to commend you for that. And if we could be helpful I haven't read the book, but I think I'm going to buy it. But we'll be very happy by reading the book, and I saw some of my readers are here, that we could really do an analysis, study it, and maybe bring you to some key Congolese, because there was a Congolese at this table who has been fighting the situation in the Congo. And they are killing people in the Congo as I speak.
Well, one of the things that we may do is,
I thank you, Mr. Chairman.
for the next meeting, we may actually purchase some books for the next meeting, so people will have the opportunity to buy them, and maybe we will have the opportunity for her to come back and just do some signing or whatever. That will be on May 21st as our next meeting. Last comment here quickly, because I'll get 2 more comments and we have to move on.
I had a question. So we know about the Oda Benga, and we know about like Sarah Bartman. How common was this zoo phenomenon in America, and what was the African American response from Europe?
Well, human zoos were very common, particularly in Europe. Late the 19th century, early in the 20th century, they were very common, held throughout Europe. What was not common, and I still haven't found another example of a young man caged with apes. So this wasn't a human zoo. This was a zoo of animals where they inserted this young man in a cage with an orangutan. So it's kind of a departure from the norm, human zoos, where they paraded people who were considered primitive, you know, through the streets, or even sometimes held them in zoo-like settings, but they were people with other people, with an understanding that they were people, even if they were regarded as primitive people. Oda Benga was viewed as subhuman just by virtue of placing him in a monkey house. So that's quite a departure from even what was so horrible about what they did. Sarah Bartman, the so-called Hottentot Venus, that was 100 years before this. This is New York City, the dawn of the 20th century, the so-called progressive era. So I think it's kind of even more jarring that, so while this was going on in New York City, Sarah Bartman's genital organs were being shown at the Museum of Man in Paris, right? So this dehumanization of African people, was on steroids then, as it is now. It's just, it morphs and it takes on different forms. But what happened to Oda Benga, you can say that, the mass incarceration of blacks today, people who were hunted, encaged, it's almost, there really are these striking parallels when it comes to the dehumanization and the ideas that were embedded in science that allow people to look at us that way. In 1906, if you had picked up an encyclopedia and looked up African, they would say midway between an orangutan and a human being, or in a European white. So these ideas were deeply ingrained in notions of the academy, and what was considered science and history, popular culture. So these ideas linger still. I recently wrote an article challenging universities which have never really refuted the prevailing science of the early 20th century. I mean, they've never just said definitively, it was all wrong. The science coming out of Harvard, the science coming out of Princeton, Yale, Columbia, all of these places, well, they say we're post-race, but we never really had the argument or the conversation about how the academy is complicit in what we see now on the streets, right? All of these young men and women, you know, being killed within a second of seeing, you know, a little kid. He's shot dead. Well, where is that coming from? Well, scientists 100 years ago said these people are savages. It was in the textbooks. It was everywhere. When did they say, oh, it was all wrong? I'm still waiting for that.
Brother Olatondo, your last words, we move on.
First and foremost, thank you so much, Dr. Anika, for honoring our invitation to come, you know, and talk about this book and some other things. I read this book, you know, and as I was reading it and trying to identify some of the challenges faced by Utabenga and other people, especially the people of the Congo, colonialism, Viking, Clever, and all those things were so disturbing that I said, wow, have we really made tremendous progress since then? And if you look at what eventually happened to Utabenga and the impact of oppression on the psyche of blacks, and we now ask questions in terms of why are they not doing it? Why are they not doing that? And but you look at the system, the structural, not just the structural injustice, the structural discrimination. Look at that. And it's no wonder that a lot of what we are experiencing, we are experiencing now. So I urge people to please try. I don't have to advertise this book, you know. I read it, you know.
I'll give you a percentage.
I really read it. And it's important for us to ask questions and to understand that even Obama is president, the struggle is far, far.
Because as you say, it's structural.
Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you.